This is the city of Rostov-On-Don. It is the largest southernmost city in the country, and by being strategically placed just northeast of the Sea of Azov, it was given significant importance in the First and Second World Wars, getting the nickname the Gateway to the Caucasus. It is also home to various Cossack groups who had a major role to play in the history of this region, even attempted to create their own republic. The nearest capital city to it is Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia, which is some 730 kilometers southeast, while the capital of Ukraine, Kiev, is the second closest, some 760 kilometers northwest. Moscow, on the other hand, is about 960 kilometers north. Easily the most interesting geographical fact is that by sitting on the mouth of the Don River and because of the Volga-Don Canal, Rostov is actually connected to 5 seas by being part of the unified deepwater system of Europe and Russia. This means that the city is directly linked to the White Sea, the Baltic, the Caspian, the Azov, the Black and the Mediterranean Seas, which makes this city of paramount importance to the Russian Federation today. So let's talk about it. Why did it all start? What happened during the Russian Revolution, the Civil War, the Great War, the Great Patriotic War, all of them? And how did the city recover and come to prosper thereafter? Let's roll. In 1749, a customs house was established by edict of Empress Elizabeth, the daughter of Peter the Great. The goal was to control trade with Turkey by taxing the goods passing through the river. This location was one of the furthest frontiers of the Russian Empire at the time, so a fortress was also built in order to protect the country. Upon its completion, it may have garrisoned as many as 4,000 soldiers at any one time. However, with the incorporation of the Ottoman Black Sea territories following the Russo-Turkish War, the settlement lost much of its military strategic importance, and trade naturally became the main occupation of its early residents. The favorable geographical position at the crossroads of land and water contributed to its economic development. A trading port was formed near its walls, which received ships of Russian, Greek, Italian, Turkish, Armenian, and Persian merchants. Its harbor was one of the earliest trade hubs in southern Russia, especially for the export of wheat, timber, and iron ore coming from the Urals. Additionally, a railway connection with Kharkiv was completed in 1870, with further links following in 1871 to Voronezh and 1875 to Vladikavkaz, aiding in the matters of transportation. By about the middle of the 19th century, Rostov became an important industrial center as well, and its population rose to about 120,000 people. And outside of the main port, the major industries included tobacco and railroading, as well as ironwork. The largest factory was the Osmolov tobacco mill, and the main workshops of the Vladikavkaz Railroad. Because railroad construction preceded industrial growth, the construction of these railroads faced major labor shortages. As a result, railwaymen's wages were exceptionally high in this region. However, this gap was overcome, and that meant that their wages would also soon decline. This decline of wages was made worse by the economic crisis, which closed off the 19th century, leading into the first events of the Russian Revolution. The study of the early roots and beginnings of the Russian Revolution is a much neglected topic, but the story of the general strikes in Rostov-On-Don in the fall of 1902 and in the several cities in the Ukraine and Caucasus has been even more neglected. However, these early outbursts were important landmarks in the development of the revolutionary working class in Russia, the precursors to the events of 1905, such as the Bloody Sunday. So the Rostov General Strike of November 1902, which brought the city to a total economic standstill, was one of the earliest signs of things to come in the country, and the revolution which would eventually follow. Initially, the strike was just a response to economic oppression that brought as many as 15,000 people together to protest, but this soon changed. The political movement of the proletariat was no longer just made up of intellectuals and students, but grew steadily out of the striking workforce, who became more and more susceptible to new political ideas. The sentiment and chant, "Down with the autocracy," began its spread on the factory floors of Rostov. To Lenin, this strike signified the proletariat's long-awaited entry onto the political scene, a huge event the revolutionaries of the country had been waiting for, and the first ever mass political strike in Russia. The event in Rostov was not the actual beginning that started the Russian Revolution, but it did prove that the workers could unite and take political stand, setting the stage for the eventual demise of the Russian monarchy. The next major uprising occurred in Rostov in October 1905, when Tsar Nicholas II released a new manifesto. The goal of his manifesto was to create the appearance of democratization in the country in order to tame the buildup of unrest and to maintain his monarchical power. So it appeared that the manifesto proclaimed and granted political rights and freedoms, such as freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, In reality, Tsar Nicholas did not intend any real changes for the country, but he did not foresee the immediate effect that his manifesto would have. Of course, by 1905, Rostov was not the only city that was in open armed rebellion, but rather the whole country. And the worst of the uprisings was the event known as Bloody Sunday in St. Petersburg on January 22, 1905. The country did not collapse yet, however, and Nicholas managed to maintain his power by brutally dispatching the rallies and strikes around the country. During the Great War, Rostov was occupied by the Germans and Austrians throughout both 1917 and 1918. The occupations proved to be rather friendly affairs, without much unnecessary bloodshed, especially as Russia withdrew from the war. The Great War had been the final chance for the Tsarist regime to survive, at first giving the people a chance to unite against the common enemy, but it proved to be its death blow instead, especially after a number of disasters on the battlefield. Nicholas was advised to abdicate, so he did, without much fuss. But the situation in Russia was so explosive that no one was willing to take his place as the next Tsar. A new country emerged, first led by the Russian Provisional Government and later by the Bolsheviks, who under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin were able to seize power. While Rostov was potentially one of the first major cities to rise up in favor of the revolution in 1902, it did the opposite during the major years of the Civil War that followed, spanning between 1917 and 1920, becoming a stronghold of the White Army movement. For Rostov and the Don River region, history took an interesting turn as the Cossacks on the Don attempted to start their own republic. Reports from Rostov say that the Republic of the Don has been declared existent with General Kalydin as president and prime minister. This meant that a kind of semi-functioning alliance was forged between the Don Cossacks and the white anti-Bolshevik army. The initial conflict which occurred around the Don River area and during the opening stages of the Civil War became known as the Railway Wars. It was a highly mobile conflict, often fought with machine gun nests mounted on the backs of trains. It wasn't a proper war, as neither the Red Army or the White had yet formed into proper fighting forces. There weren't enough soldiers fighting on either side, so there were no battle lines as such, and many skirmishes actually ended without bloodshed, as the opposing sides would often agree to mutually retreat as neither one really wanted to kill the other. The Red soldiers in particular would often run away and panic when the first shots were fired, as many of their ranks signed up to the Red Army only to receive the food rations and free clothing. Starting on the 9th of December 1917, there was a 6-day battle over Rostov, where the White forces mobilized together with the Don Cossacks and stormed in. It was the first in a series of battles over the city. In early 1918, the Red Army managed to drive the Cossacks and the White Army out, but they would come back with a vengeance as more and more Cossacks from the region would rise up in the face of the atrocities committed by the Red Army. To the Cossacks, the Reds became a foreign invading force, who they had no allegiance to, and who were trying to evict them. At its peak, the Don region mustered an army of about 40,000 soldiers, combining the White Army recruits with the local Cossack forces. And this force was able to retake the Don region, and now had a base of operation roughly the size of Belgium to draw recruits from. Had this force linked up with other White Army forces, it is possible that the Red Armies could have been defeated, but instead they chose to consolidate their powers in the region, mostly because the Cossacks were reluctant to march towards Moscow and fight outside of their homeland. It also didn't help that the White Army gave no indication that they would give the Don region its independence. To the Whites, the Don Cossacks were simply Russians, whereas the citizens of the Don did not see it that way at all. Overall, the war was lost, not just because of the lost battles and failure of different White armies to coordinate with one another, but also because they were not united by politics. Lenin was a master at propaganda, and the people were more swayed towards his cause. Even though both sides committed massive atrocities during the war, and objectively neither really was the better choice. The reluctance of the White armies to make alliances and assuming that there was no need for uniting the people to their cause was a major mistake, as they defaulted to the old traditional ways of waging war with an iron fist and terror. So the Soviet period in the history of Rostov began on February 11, 1920, when the White Army left the city, having been pushed out by the Bolshevik forces, concluding the Civil War shortly thereafter. Finally, it was time for some recovery, as the Russian people were tired after more than 15 years of unrest and violence in their country. The people didn't really get the relief that they were looking for, since in 1922 Joseph Stalin came to the power with his somewhat deranged autocratic leadership style. The people had to give up any notion of personal freedom, becoming slaves to the state, or else risk being sent to a gulag. Russia as a whole grew, and living standards improved. On December 28, 1928, Rostov-On-Don became the third largest city in Russia, after becoming one with Nakhichevan-on-Don. One of the most critical geopolitical considerations in Russia is the Volgograd Gap, a flat, vulnerable plain in Russia's south. If the enemy was to take it, then Russia could easily lose a huge part of its territory, along with its access to the Black, Azov, Caspian and Mediterranean seas. Such a loss would be devastating for the country, and of course Germans tried to do just that in both First and Second World War. Of course, Rostov and the Don region is just below the Volgograd Gap, right along the crosshairs of the Germans. Added to this, Rostov is also known as the gateway to the Caucasus, and Hitler needed the Caucasus to gain access to the oil fields located in Maikop, Grozny and Baku. In the plans of the Hitlerite command, special importance was attached to the capture of the southern regions of the USSR, and especially Rostov. Hitler gave the order to mint bronze medals for the capture of it. From the outset, Rostov was destined to be destroyed, as it was located between two major targets, getting the brunt of the German attack. On 25th of July 1942, German troops captured Rostov-On-Don for the first time. A week later, on November 28, Soviet troops launched a counter-offensive and recaptured the city. The liberation of Rostov was the first significant victory in the initial period of the war. Rostov remained Soviet until July 1942, when after the failure of the Red Army offensive near Kharkov, the German command launched another offensive, and on July 24, 1942, the Wehrmacht entered Rostov and the city fell once more. An often overlooked part of the Holocaust history occurred thereafter. A terrible mass execution of Jews was committed in the city. About 27,000 people were killed, mostly Jews. This was the worst mass execution in Russia. A memorial today stands in the city to remember this tragic act. This is the largest Holocaust memorial in Russia. The Cossacks in the Don region once again proved to be the wildcards in this fight, as they were happy to be liberated from the oppression of the communist rule. Also, Hitler and his inner circle looked favorably on the idea of forming Cossack units, since they adhered to the theory that the Cossacks were descendants of the gods, meaning that they belonged not to the Slavic, but to the Aryan race. In addition, the beginning of Hitler's political career, he was supported by some Cossack leaders. So the Cossacks ended up joining the ranks of the Wehrmacht, though they were not as significant a force in this fight as in the last. Overall, Rostov was one of the most damaged cities, with 85% of administrative and residential high-rise buildings turned into ruins. Of the 286 plants and factories, only 6 survived. The city was deprived of all basic amenities, almost totally wasted. On 27th of November 1943, Russia had mustered its strength for the big counter-offensive and pushed the Germans back out. The USSR, after relocating its economy east of the Volga River, had managed to build up enough of a force to start pushing back its invaders, and Germany, now facing major offensives from both fronts, quickly lost ground after being driven out of Leningrad in January 26, 1944, which essentially spelled the end for Hitler's plans and World War II. After complete obliteration, the city began its rapid restoration. As a historic and important Russian city, Rostov had priority status in the rebuilding efforts. By the early 1950s, the city had been recovered, and its old treasures, such as Gorky Theater, were restored. In 1952, the Volga-Don Canal was opened, and Rostov became the port of the 5 seas. After the collapse of the USSR, Rostov began to occupy the 10th place in the Russian Federation in terms of population, with over 1 million people living there. In 2000, Rostov became the center of the Southern Federal District. Unlike many other Russian cities, Rostov managed to continue its growth even throughout the 1990s, following the collapse of the USSR. Quite unusual, as most cities began to decline with a mass exodus of people because they were free to move around and even leave Russia if they wanted. The city has never stopped growing, and its population is currently stable and exceeds 1.1 million people. It is the 10th largest city in terms of population in Russia and 30th in Europe. The millionth inhabitant of the city was born back in 1987. With such an interesting and fascinating history, Rostov and the Don River region is a fascinating part of Russia, often overlooked and rarely talked about. Check out this map of Rostov-On-Don that I made for this video, and please consider supporting this channel by decorating your home with one of my maps. If you cannot afford it, I totally understand. These are tough times. Simply watching another video of mine next is good. Now guess where this is, and I will see you soon. GeoPerspective out.